Hi guys, I am here talking about the incidence of attacks or the burden of attacks. When we're looking at this here, some of the things that we want to be able to make sure we can do is recognize the amount that consumers and producers are having to pay. That's the incidence of the tax. We're also looking at the deadweight loss and the changes in consumer and producer surplus. So in going through the steps here of how to figure out the incidence of the tax, you want to have your original supply and demand curve and have a Q1, P1, which in this case here is 25 for the quantity and $8 for the price. So the tax is a determinant of supply, and it'll always shift the supply curve to the left. I think it's really smart to label it S tax instead of S2, since we're dealing with the tax and the impact that it has. And so once you have that S tax drawn, you can give your new equilibrium price and quantity here at Q2 and P2, which is at $10 and a quantity of 20. Okay, the next thing to do here is to figure out the size of a tax. And to figure out the size of a tax, you put your red dot here where you have the S tax and the demand intersecting, and you bring that down until it hits the original supply curve. Because the idea here is that this is where producers are willing and able to supply it, but this is an enforced supply curve here, and so they're still willing and able to supply this quantity of 20 at this lower price here of $6. So the size of the tax is the distance between the supply curves, which in this case here is a tax of $4 because it's $10 minus $6. And then what you want to do is you want to look at now how much consumers and producers are having to pay of this $4 tax. And so in order to do that, you look at the distance between P2 and P1, which is a price of $2, and this is the amount that the consumer has to pay. Originally, when they were buying this product before the tax, it was $8, and now with the tax, they have to pay $10 per unit. And so of that $4, the consumer is paying $2. And so then you look at the difference of what is left over with the tax, which is another $2 here, the distance between the 8 and the 6. And so when we look at the amount, the total amount that the consumer is giving to the government because of this tax, that would be this area 2 here, this rectangular box. And area 4 is the amount that the producer is having to pay to the government because of the tax. In this case here, they're equally splitting the tax, $2 a piece, because the elasticities of supply and demand are equal. And so it's divided equal when you see it. Over here, areas 3 and 5, this is the deadweight loss because of the tax. Deadweight loss is the loss of consumer and producer surplus because of the reduction in the quantity. And then you have area 1 over here, and this is where we get into consumer surplus. Remember that consumer surplus is defined or can be found as the area below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. So prior to the tax, consumer surplus was this whole area here of 1, 2, and 3. And then after the tax, consumer surplus is above the equilibrium price of P2 and below the demand curve. And so consumer surplus is reduced to this area right here of area 1. For producer surplus, we're looking at above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price. Initially, producer surplus was areas 4, 5, and 6. But now, again, producers are willing and able to still supply this product along this original supply curve. And so this is the supply curve that we use when we are looking at the producer surplus. But we can't go all the way up to the new equilibrium price because this red box here is the amount that's going to the government. And so really the producers are only receiving $6 per unit in their revenue from consumers. They have to give away $2 per unit to the government. So when we look at the new producer surplus, it is this area here of 6 below the $6 mark and above the supply curve. When you're looking at the total revenue to the government, The total revenue to the government is price times quantity, price of the tax times the quantity sold. So in this case here, the tax was $4, the quantity is 20, and so the government is receiving $80, which would be represented in this area here of 2 and 4. It's just really important to remember that consumers and producers do not win from this tax. Sometimes people want to say that the producer is making more money because the good is selling at a higher price. But again, they're at the $6 mark here because they have to give $2 per unit to the government.